Madam Secretary, thank you so much for giving us the time today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
We wanted to start, for obvious reasons, on the situation in the Middle East. And I just wondered, first of all, what your immediate reflection was when the news reached you of what was going on 9 days ago.
Well, of course, I was horrified by the atrocities that were committed against Israel. The brutality is utterly horrific, and our hearts go out to the Israeli people who have been so badly affected by this.
When we look at everything that's been said in the last few days by you and your colleagues in the US government, is it fair to say that America's support for Israel is unconditional? Or are there some conditions based on what might unfold in the days ahead?
I think America stands behind Israel, period. We stand with Israel. America has also made clear to Israel, we're working very closely with the Israelis, that they have a right to defend themselves, but it's important to try to spare innocent civilian lives to the maximum extent possible.
And is that why Secretary Blinken is returning to Israel today?
I know that Secretary Blinken is working with and talking to all of the countries in the region, including Israel.
In terms of your brief and how this relates to the less important topic of the economy, oil prices up a lot already. We're back to above $90 on Brent. Has the likelihood of a global recession risen because of the events of the last 9 days?
Well, at this point, there has been some increase in oil prices, but it's relatively modest, and oil prices are still well off their highs. We're looking at the potential economic implications of the hostilities here, although our main thoughts are with the Israeli people for what they've suffered. I think it's too early to speculate on whether or not there will be significant consequences. I think, importantly, it depends on whether the hostilities extend beyond Israel and Gaza, and that's certainly an outcome we would like to avoid.
And are you and the Treasury Department preparing for that eventuality and what it might do to the global economy if the conflict does broaden out in that way?
Look, I think it's very early days, and we're monitoring the situation at this point.
In terms of what this all means, Paul Tudor-Jones, the famed investor, was on CNBC this week, and he said, "This is the most threatening and challenging geopolitical environment that I've ever seen. At the same time, the US is in its weakest fiscal position since World War II, with debt to GDP at 122%. Can America, can the West afford another war at this time?
I think the answer is absolutely. America can certainly afford to stand with Israel and to support Israel's military needs. And we also can and must support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. And look, the American economy is doing extremely well. Inflation has been high, and it's been a concern to households. It's come down considerably. At the same time, we have about the strongest labor market we've seen in 50 years, with 3.8% unemployment. And at the same time, America, the Biden administration, has passed legislation that is strengthening our economy in the years to come for the medium term. We have 3 historic pieces of legislation: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've seen a burgeoning of investment, especially in manufacturing, an industrial renaissance in the United States. And we're creating good jobs, especially for people don't have a college education, have been left out of really economic progress in the United States. So the United States economy is in a good place. In terms of the fiscal situation, I don't know where 122 comes from. The U.S. federal debt to GDP ratio is about 98% at this point. And the interest expense, which is a more relevant statistic, still remains manageable. Now, it is true with higher interest rates, and those higher interest rates may persist, although that's not clear. We have to be careful about our fiscal path, but President Biden is committed to a sustainable fiscal path. You know, we've raised $60 billion to strengthen the Internal Revenue Service. There are enormous uncollected taxes that are due. The so-called tax gap is estimated at $7 trillion over the next decade. And finally, we're modernizing and strengthening our Internal Revenue Service so it can better serve Americans and also collect the taxes that are due. So our fiscal situation is by no means unsolvable. We have to be attentive to it. President Biden proposed a budget with $3 trillion of deficit reduction. At the same time, it has investments in the United States. Now, globally, it's certainly true that there are challenges, as your quote points out. But, I mean, what's evident is the United States is serving as a global leader in addressing very serious challenges facing the global economy. And the countries that I've talked with are very pleased that we're doing that.
I want to touch on some of those aspects and Bidenomics in particular in a moment, but just to round things off on both of the wars, and firstly on Israel and then on Ukraine. But as it relates to Israel, over the weekend, according to CBS, the US pressured Qatar not to release $6 billion to Iran that had been agreed to go back to Iran previously. What factors are you considering in terms of, from your department, to try and pressure Iran, and on what grounds was that $6 billion withheld from them?
Well, the money had been in Korea, and it was only usable for humanitarian purposes, and the money was simply transferred to Qatar from Korea, again with payments only allowed from those funds directly to providers of humanitarian services. Not a penny of that $6 billion has been spent. And I'm not going to comment on diplomatic conversations around that. I will simply say that none of that money has been touched.
Is there more that the Treasury could do to pressure Iran from not getting involved in this war?
I know that there are diplomatic conversations that are taking place, but I'm not going to go into details about them.
If we touch on Ukraine, clearly this is a war that Europe and the US are united on. But there's a big difference between the two. For one, it's on their doorstep. For you, it's 5,000 miles away. When you hear some members of Congress criticize the level of heavy lifting that the US is having to do in order to support Ukraine, do you think they have a point there?
Well, first of all, let me say it is very much in America's national security interest to help Ukraine fight this war. We're standing up for democracy and for territorial integrity, and a failure to do so would embolden Russia to take steps that would involve us in great expense, threats to democracy, and real national security risks. So this is not charity for Ukraine. This is in our interest. It's in Europe's interest. And this is something that we can afford to do. Europe is contributing heavily to this. Other countries like Japan and Canada, Australia are contributing to this effort, and it's a very important one, and we are committed to it. I believe there's a strong bipartisan coalition in Congress in favor of support to Ukraine, and President Biden and the administration will work with Congress to get this done. It is a top priority.
What do you make of the situation in Congress at the moment? I mean, are lives at stake? Is that sensationalizing the situation or not?
Well, we do need to come up with funds both for Israel and for Ukraine. This is a priority. It's really up to the House to seat a speaker and to put us in a position where legislation can be passed.
Do you think the situation is embarrassing for America at the moment?
Well, I think it shows that there's a problem in the Republican Party in terms of being able to effectively govern the country. And it is important that we be able to pass legislation.
Do you think more support for Ukraine from European countries would help arrive at that path?
There's very substantial support from European countries. They have pledged 50 billion euros in support over 4 years. And they're supporting military expenditures as well. So both the United States and Europe have provided substantial support. It's important to each of us not to be alone in doing this. The IMF has also provided a package to support Ukraine, and Ukraine is performing very well. They're dealing with problems to prevent corruption, to make sure that the money is effectively spent for the purposes that it's being given to them. I've been to Ukraine, and I can tell you that the direct economic aid that we're providing to them is what enables them to fight this war. It keeps hospitals open, schools open, supports first responders. Without that, Ukraine would not be able to wage this war effectively.
I wanted to move on and touch on the US's relationship with China, which of course has been strained in recent years. But I'm really interested as to whether the relationship has found a flaw, perhaps. Maybe it's not recovered, but perhaps the flaw is in. The readout from your meeting last week with the head of the Chinese central bank said that it was substantive and productive. You spent 4 days there in Beijing earlier this year.
Yes.
Is the flaw in?
Well, I would say perhaps. I mean, we certainly have improved communication. We've set out clearly both to Americans and also to the Chinese a set of principles that we see as governing our relationship. And they are essentially these, that first of all, we will always protect our national security and take a stand against human rights abuses. That's non-negotiable. But with respect to national security, we will, our objective is not to harm progress in China. It is really oriented at national security, and we will try to design our interventions, things like export controls, narrowly to keep them focused on real national security concerns. Second, we are not attempting to decouple from China. We have a deep economic relationship, and that kind of competition, trade and investment is beneficial to both sides, and we want an environment in which it can continue. And third, we need to cooperate on a variety of global challenges. And I would say climate change is an obvious example. And this is for both in the interest of both of us and the globe as a whole. Debt is another area where many countries are heavily indebted. We need to cooperate on debt relief. So I see those as the governing principles. And we are deepening our relationship. We have established in the aftermath of my visit an economic working group and a financial working group between Treasury and the Ministry of Finance in one case and the People's Bank of China, led by Governor Pan. We expect to have regular communications about economic and financial issues and be able to thoughtfully exchange views and see if we can find a way forward on difficult issues.
I want to talk a little bit closer to home in the UK, and you outlined some of the principles of the Bidenomics, of Inflation Reduction Act in particular, and trying to bring jobs back to the United States. I don't know if you saw the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves' speech at the Labour Party conference last week. She's talked about her vision of what she calls securonomics. She said it's inspired by Bidenomics, and that in this age of insecurity, we've got to focus on where things are being made and topics like that. Do you think that the UK should copy Bidenomics and what you've enacted in America?
Well, I think it's a good program for many economies, for the UK, for the US, and we see many European countries and the European Union moving in this direction as well. I think the pandemic and then Russia's war against Ukraine have revealed to us that our supply chains are not secure, and we all run risks because of that. And we do need to de-risk, as President von der Leyen put it. And so that's what we're doing in the United States. That's part of the UK program. Europe is looking in the same direction. Now, international trade and division of labor is important. While we see the potential in this also to create good jobs, especially for people who don't have a college degree, from pursuing this kind of supply chain de-risking. I've talked about the idea of friendshoring, that we want to maintain international trade. We want to deepen our relationships with countries who are our friends, working together to secure our supply chains. And that includes the UK and US, the EU and US, all of us working together, and including many other countries. For the United States, I've been in discussions with India, with Vietnam, with other countries. We want to see be part of this new set of supply chains.
I know we're nearly out of time, Madam Secretary, and I just wanted to dwell on your extraordinary career at the end. I mean, obviously, the first female Treasury Secretary, the first female head of the Federal Reserve before that, and I'm not sure you get enough credit on that, partly because you're so modest, but certainly not in the UK. And I guess my question as it relates to that is whether you do think you've contributed to breaking the glass ceiling in the US, and whether the US might be getting closer to being ready to elect a female president next.
Well, I think women have made tremendous advances, and I'm very heartened by that. Once upon a time, I think when I started in economics and policy jobs, it was pretty rare to see women sitting at the table, and that is changing. But there still are barriers, and it's important for us to try to break those down so that more women have opportunities. But I know that women in business and finance that I meet feel very encouraged to see that I've been able to be appointed to these top jobs. Of course, from my point of view, it's a tremendous honor and opportunity to be given the chance to contribute to critical public policy challenges of our day.
Well, and long may it continue, and congratulations on all of that. My very quick final question. I know you're not backing a woman to be president in the next election, because I know you'll be backing President Biden loud and clear. Does he still have the energy for another 5 years in the job?
Absolutely. He's very involved, very vibrant, is doing an excellent job. And I think when we face the kinds of troubles that we have in the Middle East, you can see the benefit of deep experience and understanding of global issues. He's done a remarkable job of coalescing, forming coalitions of our partners to address and holding together these coalitions to address some of the most challenging problems of our times. And I think this is what the world needs.
Madam Secretary, we're so grateful at Sky News for your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Will. Pleasure.